The incident report filed at Sing Sing Correctional Facility on November 14, 1952, was remarkably brief for an event that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics of New York's most notorious maximum security prison. Inmate number 37624 sustained severe ocular trauma during an altercation in the prison yard at approximately 2:35 p.m. Medical examination revealed complete loss of vision in the left eye due to blunt force trauma. Inmate refused to identify his attacker. Investigation ongoing. What the report didn't mention, what it couldn't mention, was that the altercation had been witnessed by 47 inmates and 3 guards, yet not a single person would provide a statement identifying the perpetrator. What it didn't record was that the victim, a white supremacist named Dale Hutchins who'd been terrorizing black inmates for 6 years, had spent the previous week publicly mocking and threatening Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most feared gangster, who'd arrived at Sing Sing just 11 days earlier. And what absolutely wasn't documented anywhere in official records was what Bumpy Johnson had said to Hutchins exactly 90 seconds before the attack. "You've got about a minute to apologize. After that, the choice won't be yours anymore." Hutchins had laughed. It was the last mistake he would make with both eyes intact. But to understand why a racist prisoner would be foolish enough to mock Bumpy Johnson, to comprehend how a 47-year-old man who'd been in prison for less than 2 weeks could orchestrate violence so precise that no witness would testify, and to grasp why this single incident would transform Sing Sing's racial dynamics for the next decade, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in November 1952. By 1952, Bumpy had been in and out of prison multiple times. This wasn't his first stint at Sing Sing. He'd served time there in the early 1930s. But this sentence was different. In July 1952, federal prosecutors had finally built a case against him that stuck: conspiracy to sell heroin. The irony was bitter. Bumpy had spent his entire criminal career refusing to deal drugs, maintaining his principle that narcotics destroyed communities. But federal authorities, desperate to remove him from Harlem's streets, had constructed a conspiracy case built on testimony from informants who'd later be revealed as unreliable. Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years. He was 47 years old, his health wasn't perfect, and 15 years might as well have been a life sentence. When he arrived at Sing Sing on November 3, 1952, many assumed his power had died with his freedom. Dale Hutchins certainly thought so. Hutchins was 32 years old, serving 25 years for armed robbery and assault. He was 6'3", weighed 220 pounds, and had spent the last 6 years building a reputation as the most dangerous white supremacist in Sing Sing. He ran a gang of 12 white inmates who controlled certain parts of the prison through intimidation and violence. They targeted black inmates specifically, using racial slurs, physical attacks, and a reign of terror that the guards either couldn't or wouldn't stop. According to prison records, there have been 17 documented assaults involving Hutchins or his associates between 1946 and 1952. In each case, the victims, all black inmates, either refused to identify their attackers or were too intimidated to press charges. Hutchins had been placed in solitary confinement 3 times, but he always emerged with his gang intact and his power enhanced. When Bumpy Johnson arrived at Sing Sing, Hutchins saw an opportunity. Here was Harlem's legendary gangster, diminished by age and imprisonment, vulnerable and isolated. If Hutchins could publicly humiliate Bumpy, it would cement his own status as the prison's apex predator. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, because what Hutchins didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that Bumpy Johnson's power had never been about physical dominance or loud displays of strength. It had always been about strategic thinking, careful observation, and the ability to turn an enemy's confidence into a weapon against them. And in the 11 days between Bumpy's arrival and November 14th, he'd been doing exactly what he'd always done: watching, learning, mapping power structures, identifying weaknesses, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. When that confrontation came in the prison yard on November 14th at 2:35 p.m., it lasted less than 45 seconds. But the consequences would echo through Sing Sing for years. The man who attacked Hutchins was never officially identified, but everyone knew. And the fact that everyone knew while no one would testify became its own form of power, a demonstration that Bumpy Johnson could orchestrate violence so publicly yet remain officially untouchable. But more than that, what happened to Dale Hutchins became a message about respect, about consequences, and about what happens when you mistake a temporary loss of freedom for a permanent loss of power. Hutchins had mocked Bumpy for a week. He'd called him racial slurs. He'd threatened him publicly. He tried to establish dominance through intimidation. Bumpy had smiled through it all, quiet, patient, waiting. And then, on November 14th, 1952, in a prison yard in Ossining, New York, Bumpy Johnson reminded everyone, guards, inmates, administrators, that some men carry their power with them no matter where they go. The smile was the warning. The injury was the lesson. And the silence that followed was absolute. Sing Sing Correctional Facility in 1952 was a world unto itself. A 55-acre compound perched on the banks of the Hudson River in Ossining, New York, housing approximately 2,400 inmates in conditions that range from brutal to barely humane. The prison had been operational since 1826, and by the 1950s, it had earned a reputation as one of the toughest maximum security facilities in the United States. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1891 and 1963, Sing Sing executed 614 people in its electric chair, more than any other prison in American history. The cell blocks were overcrowded, with men living in 6-by-8-foot cells designed in the 19th century. Violence was endemic. The prison averaged approximately one serious assault per week, though many incidents went unreported because inmates feared retaliation more than they trusted official protection. But the statistics don't capture the most important reality of Sing Sing in 1952. It was a rigidly segregated environment where racial tensions simmered constantly and occasionally erupted into violence that prison authorities struggled to control. Black inmates made up approximately 35% of Sing Sing's population in 1952, but they were systematically excluded from the best jobs, subjected to harsher discipline, and vulnerable to attacks from organized white supremacist groups. The prison's official policy was integration, but the reality was very different. Dining halls had unofficial racial boundaries. Work assignments were segregated by practice, if not by rule. In certain areas of the prison, particularly Cell Block D, where Dale Hutchins held sway, were effectively controlled by white supremacist gangs. The guards at Sing Sing in 1952 were overwhelmingly white and working class. According to employment records, approximately 87% of the 280 correctional officers were white men, many from nearby towns where racial attitudes mirrored the broader prejudices of the era. Some guards were professional and fair. Others were openly racist and used their authority to enable or even participate in the racial hierarchy that prisoners had established. Warden Thomas Wick, who ran Sing Sing from 1950 to 1956, was a reformer in theory, but a pragmatist in practice. He'd implemented some progressive policies, education programs, job training, limited recreational activities, but he also understood that maintaining order in a maximum security prison sometimes meant allowing informal power structures to exist as long as they didn't threaten overall institutional control. This created an environment where someone like Dale Hutchins could operate with relative impunity. As long as his gang's violence stayed within certain bounds, no murders, no riots, no media attention, the administration treated him as a manageable problem rather than an urgent crisis. Into this environment came Bumpy Johnson on November 3, 1952. Bumpy's arrival was noted by both inmates and staff, though for different reasons. For the inmates, particularly the black prisoners, Bumpy represented something rare, proof that a black man could achieve power and respect in white-dominated criminal networks. Stories of his exploits in Harlem circulated constantly. How he'd stood up to the Italian mob, how he'd protected his community, how he'd built an empire through intelligence rather than just violence. For the guards and administrators, Bumpy was a management challenge. They knew his reputation. They knew he had connections to organized crime families outside the prison. And they knew that someone with his strategic mind and leadership ability could potentially organize inmates in ways that threatened institutional control. The initial assessment from prison officials was documented in Bumpy's intake report. Inmate Johnson presents as calm and cooperative. However, due to his criminal history and leadership capabilities, recommend close monitoring for attempts to organize other inmates or establish unauthorized power structures. What the officials didn't realize was that Bumpy had no intention of establishing power structures. He was simply going to tap into the ones that already existed. During his first week at Sing Sing, Bumpy did what he always did. He observed. He noticed who had power and how they exercised it. He identified the informal hierarchies among inmates. He noted which guards were fair, which were corrupt, and which could be influenced. And he paid particular attention to Dale Hutchins. Hutchins ran his gang from cell block D, where he'd secured a cell that gave him visual command of a long corridor. His 12 core associates were strategically distributed throughout the cell block, allowing him to monitor movement and coordinate responses to perceived threats. The gang had developed a sophisticated system of communication using codes, gestures, and intermediaries. They also had support from at least 3 guards, men who shared Hutchins's racial attitudes and who would look the other way during attacks or provide advance warning when administrators were planning shakedowns or transfers. According to later testimony from Frank Morrison, a black inmate who'd been at Sing Sing since 1948, Hutchins's gang had created a climate of constant fear for black prisoners. You couldn't walk certain corridors alone. You couldn't use certain tables in the dining hall. And if you looked at one of Hutchins's people the wrong way, you'd find yourself cornered in a bathroom or a stairwell with 3 or 4 of them, making it clear what would happen if you didn't show proper respect. This was the system that Bumpy encountered when he arrived. A system of racial terrorism operating with semi-official sanction inside a maximum security prison. And Hutchins, seeing an opportunity to enhance his reputation, decided to make Bumpy his next target. The mistake wasn't in challenging Bumpy directly, though that was certainly foolish. The real mistake was in assuming that Bumpy was alone, powerless, and vulnerable simply because he'd been imprisoned. Hutchins didn't understand that Bumpy had spent 30 years building networks that transcended prison walls. He didn't realize that several inmates at Sing Sing, both black and white, had connections to Bumpy through Harlem's criminal networks or through the Italian mob families that Bumpy had worked with. And he certainly didn't grasp that Bumpy's reputation meant that even prisoners who'd never met him respected him enough to listen if he needed something. Within 3 days of arriving at Sing Sing, Bumpy had identified at least 8 inmates who could be useful allies. Within a week, he had a clear understanding of the prison's power dynamics, guard rotations, and vulnerable points in the institution's security. And by November 10th, when Dale Hutchins made his first public move against Bumpy, Bumpy already knew exactly how the situation would play out. He just needed to wait for Hutchins to commit fully to his mistake. The harassment began on November 10th, 7 days after Bumpy's arrival at Sing Sing. It started in the dining hall during lunch. Bumpy was sitting with 2 other black inmates, Frank Morrison and a younger man named Thomas Reed, who was serving time for burglary. They were at a table near the wall, a strategic position that allowed observation of the room while minimizing exposure from behind. Dale Hutchins entered with 4 of his associates. They didn't sit immediately. Instead, they walked past Bumpy's table, and Hutchins stopped directly behind Bumpy's chair. Well, Hutchins said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. The famous Bumpy Johnson. Harlem's big, man. Doesn't look so big now, does he, boys? Bumpy continued eating, not turning around, not acknowledging the comment. Hutchins leaned closer. I'm talking to you, old man. Where I come from. When a white man speaks to you, you show respect. Frank Morrison tensed, preparing to stand. But Bumpy placed a hand on his arm, a gentle restraint. Still didn't turn around. What's wrong? Hutchins continued. Cat got your tongue? Or did they take your balls when they took your freedom? The dining hall had gone quieter. Other inmates watched, trying to gauge how this confrontation would play. Guards at their posts noticed the interaction, but didn't intervene. Standing and talking wasn't against regulations, and none of Hutchins's words were technically threatening enough to justify action. Finally, Bumpy turned his chair. He looked up at Hutchins, who stood a good 6 inches taller, and he smiled. Not a broad smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. The same smile he'd worn at Helen Lawrence's burn dress shop. The same smile he'd given the KKK members in the Bronx warehouse. The smile that people who knew him understood as a warning. You done? Bumpy asked quietly. Hutchins, not understanding the danger, laughed. Am I done? I ain't even started, boy. See, we run things in cell block D. And you just got here, which means you're at the bottom. Which means you're going to learn real quick about showing proper respect to your betters. Bumpy nodded slowly, the smile still in place. Okay, he said simply, and turned back to his meal. Hutchins, unsatisfied with the lack of reaction, kicked the leg of Bumpy's chair, not hard enough to knock him over, but enough to jolt him. Then he walked away, laughing with his associates. The next provocation came on November 11th in the recreation yard. Bumpy was walking the perimeter, something he did daily to stay active and to observe the prison's patterns. Hutchins and 3 of his gang members intercepted him near the weight pile. Hey, Johnson, Hutchins called out. Heard you used to be somebody in Harlem. Heard you had respect. That must feel different now, huh? Being nobody. Being just another old convict counting down the days. Bumpy stopped walking. Looked at Hutchins. Same smile. You spend a lot of time thinking about me, don't you? Thinking about you. Hutchins laughed. Man, I'm just making sure you understand how things work here. This ain't Harlem. This is my world. And in my world, your kind needs to remember their place. And what place is that? At the bottom, where you belong. Bumpy nodded, as if considering this carefully. Then, how many times have you been in solitary? 3? 4? Hutchins's smile faltered slightly. What? Solitary confinement. You've been there multiple times, right? For fighting. For threatening other inmates. Must be difficult being locked in a small cell with nothing but your thoughts. Makes a man realize how alone he really is. Are you threatening me? No, Bumpy said calmly. Just making conversation. You seem concerned about places and where people belong. I was wondering where you feel you belong. Hutchins stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. I belong wherever I want to be, and you belong wherever I tell you to be. Bumpy's smile widened slightly. We'll see. He walked away, leaving Hutchins frustrated by the lack of fear or submission he'd been trying to provoke. The harassment escalated on November 12th. Hutchins arranged for one of his associates, a man named Carl Becker, to accidentally bump into Bumpy in a crowded corridor, spilling his coffee and then blaming Bumpy for the collision. When Bumpy didn't react with anger, Becker escalated, pushing him against the wall. Watch where you're going, Becker snarled. Bumpy straightened his shirt, looked at Becker with that same calm expression, and said, You're going to want to remember this moment. Later, when things change, you're going to wish you'd made a different choice right here. Becker was confused by the response. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means you're making decisions without understanding their consequences. But you will. Soon. By November 13th, the entire prison was watching. The confrontation between Hutchins and Bumpy had become a test of power dynamics. Would the established racist gang leader successfully intimidate the legendary Harlem gangster, or would Bumpy somehow reestablish his reputation despite being new and outnumbered? That evening in cell block D, Hutchins gathered his core gang members for a meeting. According to later testimony from an inmate named Joseph Ricci, who had a cell nearby and overheard the conversation, Hutchins was frustrated. "This Johnson guy isn't breaking," Hutchins said. "I've pushed him, threatened him, had Becker knock him around, and he just smiles. Like he knows something we don't. Maybe we need to do more than talk," one of his associates suggested. "Tomorrow," Hutchins said. "Tomorrow in the yard. We'll make it clear. Public. Make him understand that his reputation doesn't mean anything here." What Hutchins didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that while he'd been focusing on Bumpy had been building alliances. Frank Morrison, the inmate who'd been at Bumpy's table during the first confrontation, had been spreading the word among black inmates. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd protected Harlem for decades, was being targeted by Hutchins's gang. And Bumpy wasn't asking anyone to fight for him. He was just making it known that when the confrontation came, people would want to be paying attention. Thomas Reed, the younger inmate, had connections to the Italian mob through his cousin who ran with a crew in Brooklyn. Reed sent word through the prison's informal communication network to 3 Italian inmates who had ties to families that had worked with Bumpy in Harlem. The message was simple: Bumpy Johnson is one of ours. He's earned respect, and anyone who helps him will be remembered. And Bumpy himself had been quietly meeting with inmates throughout the prison, not organizing a gang, but simply having conversations, building relationships, establishing the same kind of network he'd built everywhere else he'd operated. By the evening of November 13th, the prison was divided into 2 camps: those who thought Hutchins would successfully humiliate Bumpy, and those who believed that Bumpy was somehow in control of a situation that appeared to favor his enemy. The smart money was on Bumpy, because people who'd actually been paying attention had noticed something. Every time Hutchins provoked him, Bumpy smiled. And that smile wasn't the smile of a victim or someone afraid. It was the smile of someone who already knew how the story ended. November 14th, 1952, would prove them right. The prison yard at Sing Sing was approximately 100 yards long and 60 yards wide, surrounded by 30-foot concrete walls topped with guard towers. Recreation time was scheduled in shifts to prevent overcrowding, with approximately 200 inmates in the yard during any given period. The yard was monitored by 6 guards positioned at various points, including 2 in elevated positions with clear sight lines across the entire space. November 14th was cold, temperature in the low 40s with a gray sky threatening rain. But fair weather inmates still came out for recreation time, which ran from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Bumpy Johnson entered the yard at 2:12 p.m., accompanied by Frank Morrison and Thomas Reed. Dale Hutchins was already there, surrounded by 8 members of his gang. They were near the wait area, an informal territory that Hutchins's group had claimed as their own. When Bumpy entered, Hutchins made a show of pointing him out to his associates and laughing. Bumpy didn't acknowledge them. He walked to the opposite side of the yard and began his usual perimeter walk, a measured, steady pace that he maintained for exercise and observation. According to later statements from multiple witnesses, what happened over the next 20 minutes played out with an almost choreographed precision, though no one would claim it was planned. At 2:18 p.m., Hutchins and his entire gang, all 8 men, left the wait area and walked across the yard to intercept Bumpy. This movement was noticed by every inmate present and by the guards on duty. It was unusual for Hutchins's whole crew to move together in such an obvious display of force. They formed a semicircle around Bumpy, cutting off his path. Other inmates in the area backed away, creating a clearing. The closest guard, Officer Martin Reeves, began walking toward the group, but didn't rush. Fights in the yard were common, and guards typically waited to see if situations would de-escalate naturally before intervening. "Johnson," Hutchins said, loud enough for the entire yard to hear, "we need to have a conversation about respect." Bumpy stopped walking. He turned to face Hutchins directly, and that smile, the smile that had been present all week, appeared again. "Do we?" Bumpy asked quietly. "Yeah, we do. See, you've been here almost 2 weeks now, and you still haven't shown proper understanding of how things work. Maybe you're too old to learn. Maybe you're just stupid. But either way, it ends today. What ends? Your disrespect, your attitude, your whole way of carrying yourself like you're still somebody. Bumpy glanced at the 8 men surrounding him, then back at Hutchins. These are friends. These are the people who run this prison. And we've decided you need to be taught a lesson. Okay, Bumpy said, in the same calm tone he'd maintained all week. But first, let me tell you something. Actually, let me ask you something. Do you know what the most important skill in prison is? Hutchins was thrown off by the question. What? The most important skill in prison is counting. Being able to count. How many guards are watching? How many people are on your side? How many people are against you? Have you been counting, Dale? I don't need to count. I've got 8 men with me. You're alone. Bumpy's smile widened. Am I? Look around. Hutchins glanced around the yard, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. Because the yard had changed. While Hutchins had been focused on surrounding Bumpy, other inmates had been moving. Not obviously. Not in a coordinated rush. Just shifting positions. And now, instead of backing away from the confrontation, dozens of inmates had moved closer, forming a larger circle around Hutchins's group. Frank Morrison was 3 yards to Bumpy's left. Thomas Reed was to his right. But beyond them were at least 20 other inmates. Black inmates who'd been targets of Hutchins's gang, Italian inmates who had connections to Bumpy through organized crime networks, even a few white inmates who'd been victims of Hutchins's intimidation over the years. They weren't forming an aggressive line. They weren't making threats. They were just there, present, watching. You wanted to talk about numbers, Bumpy said quietly. So let's count. You got 8 people. How many do you think I have? Hutchins looked around, starting to understand that the situation wasn't what he'd assumed. This don't change anything, he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. It changes everything. See, you spent the last week thinking you were teaching me about power, but what you were really doing was showing everyone in this prison exactly who you are. A bully. Someone who only feels strong when he's got numbers and weapons. Someone who picks targets he thinks are vulnerable. I ain't afraid of you, old man. You should be, Bumpy said, and the smile vanished completely. Because I gave you a week. A whole week to apologize, to back down, to recognize that you made a mistake targeting me. But you didn't. You doubled down. And now, he glanced at the guards, who were now moving closer to the growing crowd. Officer Reeves was within 15 yards, watching carefully but not yet intervening. Now it's too late, Bumpy finished. Too late for what? Hutchins demanded, trying to sound tough but clearly shaken by the shift in dynamics. For the choice to be yours. And that's when it happened. Not from Bumpy. Not from any of the inmates in the larger circle. But from within Hutchins's own group. Carl Becker, the same man who'd pushed Bumpy in the corridor 2 days earlier, suddenly stepped back from Hutchins's group. Just one step. But it was enough to create a gap in their semicircle. Carl, Hutchins said, confused. I'm out, Becker said quietly. This ain't worth it. What are you talking about? But Becker didn't answer. He just kept backing away until he was completely separate from the group. Then another of Hutchins's associates, a man named Donald Pierce, also stepped back. Yeah, he said, I'm done with this too. Within 30 seconds, 3 of Hutchins's 8 men had separated themselves from the group. The semicircle had collapsed. Hutchins was left with 5 supporters instead of 8, and the psychological advantage had completely reversed. You're all dead. Hutchins shouted at the defectors. You hear me? No. Bumpy interrupted. They're smart. They counted better than you did. They realized that being loyal to you was more dangerous than walking away. And they were right. Hutchins turned back to Bumpy, rage replacing his earlier confidence. You think you've won? You think. He never finished the sentence. Because at that moment, a basketball, thrown from somewhere in the crowd of inmates, struck Hutchins directly in the face with enough force to stagger him backward. The guards, seeing the thrown object and Hutchins's violent reaction, rushed forward. Officer Reeves shouted for everyone to freeze. But in the chaos of guards, pushing through the crowd and inmates moving in multiple directions. What happened next would be impossible to reconstruct with certainty. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Hutchins lunge toward where he thought the basketball had come from. Other witnesses saw him slip on the asphalt and fall. Still others claimed he was pushed from behind. What everyone agreed on was the result. Hutchins fell hard, and when he landed, his left eye made contact with a piece of concrete debris, maybe a chip from the yard degrading surface, maybe something else, with devastating force. The scream he let out could be heard across the entire yard. By the time guards reached him, blood was streaming from his left eye socket. The injury was immediately catastrophic. The eyeball itself had ruptured, and even with rapid medical intervention, vision in that eye would be permanently lost. Bumpy Johnson was 15 feet away when it happened, standing calmly with his hands visible and making no threatening moves. When Officer Reeve questioned him about what he'd seen, Bumpy simply shrugged. Man slipped and fell. Tragic accident. 47 inmates were in the yard. Not one could identify who threw the basketball. Not one could definitively say whether Hutchins was pushed or slipped. And not one would testify about anything they'd witnessed. The prison launched an investigation. But without witnesses, without evidence, without anyone willing to speak, there was nothing to investigate. Dale Hutchins was transported to the prison hospital, then to an outside facility for emergency surgery that ultimately couldn't save his eye. And Bumpy Johnson went back to his cell, where Frank Morrison found him an hour later. "Everyone's talking about it," Frank said. "Whole prison knows what happened." "What happened?" Bumpy asked calmly. "Man had an accident in the yard." "Right. An accident." Frank paused. "That smile you had. You knew, didn't you? You knew exactly how it would go down." Bumpy didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Hutchins spent a week trying to prove he had power over me. What he didn't understand is that real power isn't about who can throw the hardest punch or make the loudest threats. Real power is about who people choose to follow when it matters, who they're willing to protect, who they're willing to lie for. You turned his own people against him. I gave him better options. That's all. And when the moment came, they made their choices. If you're seeing how power really works, not Hollywood's version, but the actual strategic thinking that separates survivors from victims, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter because they show you the truth that most people never see. Now let's talk about what happened after Dale Hutchins lost his eye, because that's when things got really interesting. Dale Hutchins returned to Sing Sing 12 days after the incident, on November 26, 1952. He wore a patch over his left eye and moved with the careful hesitance of someone whose spatial perception had been permanently altered. The medical report indicated complete loss of vision in the left eye, partial hearing damage from the fall, and recommendation for psychological evaluation given the trauma of the injury. But the physical damage was only part of what had changed. When Hutchins returned to cell block D, he discovered that the power structure he'd built over 6 years had completely collapsed. The 3 men who'd abandoned him in the yard, Becker, Pierce, and a third man named Raymond Walsh, had formally distanced themselves from his gang. They didn't join any other group. They simply made it clear they were no longer part of Hutchins's organization. The 5 who'd remained loyal during the incident had fractured in his absence. 2 had gotten into a fight with each other over some petty dispute, resulting in both being sent to solitary confinement. Another had requested a transfer to a different cell block. The remaining 2 were still nominally loyal to Hutchins, but without the larger gang structure, they had no real power. More significantly, the racial dynamics in cell block D had shifted. Black inmates who'd spent years avoiding certain corridors or tables now walked freely. The informal segregation that Hutchins had enforced through intimidation had dissolved, and the guards who'd previously enabled his gang, either through active cooperation or strategic blindness, were now under scrutiny following the yard incident. Warden Wick, responding to the investigation even though it had produced no actionable findings, had reassigned 2 guards from cell block D and issued a memo emphasizing that any guard found facilitating inmate gang activity or racial intimidation will face immediate termination. This wasn't primarily about justice, it was about liability. The warden couldn't afford another high-profile incident. The transformation was documented in prison reports from late November and December 1952. Incident reports from Cell Block D, which had averaged 2 to 3 per week under Hutchins's reign, dropped to less than 1 per month. Requests for protective custody from black inmates decreased by 60%, and the general atmosphere, according to multiple sources, shifted from one of constant tension to something approaching normalcy. But perhaps the most telling change was in how other inmates treated Dale Hutchins himself. Before the yard incident, Hutchins had commanded respect through fear. Inmates would step aside when he walked down a corridor. They'd avoid eye contact. They'd modify their behavior to avoid his attention. After November 14th, he was largely ignored, not openly disrespected. That would have been dangerous and unnecessary, but simply irrelevant. Inmates walked past him without acknowledgement. His attempts to reassert authority were met with polite indifference. The power that seemed so solid just weeks earlier had evaporated like morning fog. According to testimony from Joseph Ricci, the inmate who'd overheard Hutchins's gang meeting, the psychological impact was devastating. Hutchins couldn't handle it. He'd built his whole identity around being feared, and suddenly nobody feared him anymore. He'd walk into the dining hall, and no one would even look at him. It was like he'd become invisible. There were rumors that Hutchins attempted to retaliate against Bumpy, that he tried to organize attacks or threats. But these rumors never materialized into action. The truth was simpler and more humiliating. Hutchins no longer had the resources or support to threaten anyone, let alone someone with Bumpy Johnson's network and reputation. Meanwhile, Bumpy's status in the prison had transformed dramatically. He didn't become a gang leader. That wasn't his style and wasn't necessary. Instead, he became something more valuable, a mediator, an advisor, a figure of respect who could help resolve disputes before they escalated into violence. When conflict arose between inmates, they increasingly sought Bumpy's input. When someone had a problem with guards or administration, they asked if Bumpy had suggestions. And when racial tensions threatened to boil over, which still happened occasionally, Bumpy's calm presence and strategic thinking helped de-escalate situations that might otherwise have turned violent. Prison records from 1953 to 1954 show a marked decrease in serious violence at Sing Sing, particularly in Cell Block D. While causation is difficult to prove, multiple sources from that period credited the changing atmosphere to the power shift that occurred in November 1952. Warden Wick, in a private letter to the New York State Department of Corrections written in March 1953, noted, "The Johnson situation has proven unexpectedly beneficial. While I cannot officially condone an inmate exercising informal authority, the practical reality is that his presence has contributed to improved stability in Cell Block D and reduced racial tensions throughout the facility." This wasn't to say that Bumpy was working for the prison administration or that he'd somehow become a model inmate. He was still a convicted criminal serving time for conspiracy to sell heroin. A charge he maintained was fabricated. He still had his own agenda and his own interests. But he demonstrated once again what he'd proven throughout his life, that intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to build networks were more powerful than physical strength or loud displays of dominance. Dale Hutchins served another 14 years at Sing Sing before being paroled in 1966. According to parole records, his time after the November 1952 incident was unremarkable. No serious disciplinary infractions, no leadership roles in any inmate groups, no further violence. He'd become exactly what Bumpy had predicted, just another inmate counting down the days. After his release, Hutchins moved to a small town in Pennsylvania and worked various manual labor jobs until his death in 1981. According to his obituary in the local newspaper, He was survived by a sister and was described as a quiet man who kept to himself. There was no mention of his prison time or his former life as a gang leader. The eye patch he wore for the rest of his life was a constant reminder of November 14th, 1952, the day he learned that reputation and power aren't the same thing, and that underestimating your opponent based on age, race, or circumstance can have permanent consequences. But the real lesson of the Hutchins incident wasn't about physical injury or lost status. It was about the fundamental nature of power in environments where traditional authority structures are compromised or corrupt. Bumpy Johnson spent 5 years at Sing Sing during this sentence before being paroled in 1957. During those 5 years, he maintained the same approach that had defined his career in Harlem: strategic thinking, network building, and protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. Frank Morrison, the inmate who'd been at Bumpy's table during the first confrontation with Hutchins, was paroled in 1955. In an interview conducted in the 1970s as part of an oral history project about Harlem, Morrison reflected on what he'd witnessed. "Bumpy taught me something important in that prison. He taught me that respect can't be demanded, it has to be earned." Hutchins tried to demand respect through fear and violence. But the moment someone wasn't afraid of him anymore, he had nothing. Bumpy never demanded anything. He just carried himself with dignity, treated people fairly, and when he needed support, it was there. That's the difference between fear and respect. Thomas Reed, the younger inmate who'd helped Bumpy build connections, was paroled in 1954. He later worked for a legitimate trucking company in New York and occasionally provided security services for businesses in Harlem. According to people who knew him, Reed would sometimes tell the story of what happened in the Sing Sing yard, though he always emphasized the strategic aspects rather than the violence. What impressed me wasn't that Hutchins got hurt. Prison violence is common. What impressed me was how Bumpy turned the entire situation around without ever throwing a punch himself. He identified Hutchins's weaknesses, the fact that his gang was held together by fear rather than loyalty. Then he gave those gang members better options and waited for them to make their own choices. When the confrontation came, Hutchins's own organization abandoned him. That's genius. The guards who worked Cell Block D during this period had mixed reactions. Officer Martin Reeves, who'd been first on scene during the yard incident, wrote in his retirement memoir, "I knew something had happened that day beyond a simple accident, but I also knew that whatever happened had made my job easier." The racial tension that had made Cell Block D dangerous for years decreased significantly after Johnson arrived. Was he a criminal? Yes. But he was also someone who understood how to maintain order in ways that official authority sometimes couldn't. Other guards were less charitable, seeing Bumpy's influence as a threat to institutional control. But even they had to admit that the reduction in violence was real and measurable. The broader implications of the Hutchins incident extended beyond Sing Sing. In prisons throughout New York State, the story circulated among inmates, often exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but always carrying the same core message. Bumpy Johnson had walked into one of America's toughest prisons, faced down a white supremacist gang leader, and completely reversed the power dynamic without official authority or overwhelming force. This enhanced Bumpy's already legendary status. When he was paroled in 1957 and returned to Harlem, his reputation had actually grown during his incarceration rather than diminished. For the broader black community, the Hutchins incident represented something significant. In 1952 America, where racial segregation was legal in much of the country and where black Americans had limited recourse against discrimination and violence, the story of Bumpy Johnson standing up to and defeating a white supremacist prison gang resonated deeply. It wasn't a perfect justice. Bumpy was still a criminal, prison was still a brutal environment, and Hutchins's injury didn't change the systemic racism that pervaded American institutions. But it was a victory nonetheless, and in an era when victories were rare, it mattered. The incident report filed on November 14, 1952, remained officially unresolved. Despite the investigation, despite the witnesses, despite the obvious significance of what had occurred, the official record simply stated, "Incident under investigation." No charges filed. This official ambiguity became its own form of power, because everyone knew what had happened, or at least knew the broad outlines, but no one could prove it. And that uncertainty, that gap between what was known and what could be documented, created a mythology that was more powerful than any factual account could have been. The smile that Bumpy wore throughout that week of provocation became part of the legend. Inmates who'd been at Sing Sing during that period would tell new arrivals, "When Bumpy Johnson smiled at you, that's when you should have been most worried." The smile became a symbol of strategic patience, of confidence in the face of threat, of knowing that apparent vulnerability could be a setup for devastating reversal. Dale Hutchins, in the rare moments when he spoke about his time in prison, never mentioned the incident directly. But people who knew him in his later years said he would sometimes touch the eye patch and fall silent, lost in memories of how completely his world had changed in 45 seconds on a November afternoon. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, at age 62, collapsing from a heart attack in Harlem's Wells restaurant while having breakfast. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, criminals and community leaders, numbers runners and civil rights activists, people who'd been protected by him, and people who'd been victimized by his criminal enterprises. Among the stories told at his funeral and in the days after, the Sing Sing incident with Dale Hutchins was mentioned frequently, not as a tale of violence or revenge, but as an example of Bumpy's fundamental approach to power: strategic thinking, careful observation, patience, and the ability to turn an enemy's strength into their weakness.